rhythm of life. How many people's calendars and diaries look like this? Wall to wall, busy. One thing after another, never stopping, never a chance to reflect, to stop in the course of most days. How many people live lives which are really pretty stressful? How many of the words on screen speak to you about the way your life is, or could be, or has been at times in the past? How many people do you know who are living in a very stressful way? The latest estimates from the Labour Force Survey show that the total number of cases of work-related stress, depression or anxiety from 2015 to 16 was 488,000 cases. That's 1,510 per 100,000 workers. In that same time period, stress accounted for 37% of all work-related ill health cases and 45% of all working days lost due to ill health. That's a high percentage, isn't it? Stress is more prevalent, it seems, in public service industries such as education, health and social care, and public administration and defence. But of course there are many other factors which contribute to stress and anxiety and depression than those that are work related. A lot are related to financial pressures. How many people, for example, feel that they have to work and work and work and work extra hours just to keep up with their mortgage or with any other number of financial things that they have taken on? How many people find that family life and the expectations that we have of one another and of ourselves just are too much? Children always being ferried from one club, from one activity to another. Do we perhaps enter into a way of life that we don't think about and that we are just constantly on the go in? And we live in an age where there is information overload, where we're constantly being told what we should be thinking, wearing, eating and doing. Do we really have space to reflect? Have we got out of kilter with what being human really means? I wonder what your experience of life is like right now. When we ran these sessions during the Festival of Faith 2017, people had an opportunity to talk to one another. And everyone, whether retired or still working, recognised that pace of life that was just not healthy, either in themselves or perhaps in their children, in their grandchildren. It's certainly part of modern life. So the question remains, is there a better way to live than many of us do in the Western world, with all the pressures that come at us from so many sides? Let's just think about the natural rhythms of life, the way that nature is. Natural, healthy rhythms. Think of the seasons. From spring to summer, to autumn, to winter, how there are seasons for in a cycle of life. Think of the 24-hour day, of the natural rhythm of the day and night, the circadian rhythm, the one where we must rest, where we must sleep so that we can function, so that our bodies can repair themselves. That's built in to the way of life. Going back to the Old Testament, to the Bible, and the law that Moses gave to, or that God gave to Moses. And that Sabbath, you shall keep the Sabbath day holy, a day which God said should be set apart, a day that God said should be a day where we cease from working, where we're still, where we seek Him, and where we perhaps reconnect with who we really are and with who God really is. Jesus said, "I have come that you might have life and have it to the full." That's from John chapter 10. He didn't say, "I have come to place heavy burdens on you." He didn't say, "I have come so that you will work harder and harder and harder, and so that you will feel guilt." He said, "I've come to reconnect you with life. I have come to reconnect you with God and with who you were always meant to be." And Jesus very much lived a rhythm of life that was clear if you read the Gospels, and it can be described in a number of ways. For example, Jesus always took Sabbath rest, but at the same time not treating that Sabbath rest legalistically. If there was good to be done on the Sabbath, on the day of rest, then he would do it. Sabbath was made for people, he said, not the other way around. And he very much lived out that Sabbath principle through each day, there being times of rest through the week, times of rest through the year, times of getting away, times of retreat and reflection, time set aside for prayer each and every day, time set aside for gathered worship, meeting with his brothers and sisters either in the temple in Jerusalem or in the synagogues. Time for work was important too. Time for teaching, time for healing and so on, that Jesus spent so much of his time doing. That was an important part of his life. And Jesus also maintained a balance of relationships, and we can refer to this as up, in and out. Up, the relationship with the Father, where he would draw strength from his Father in heaven. Relationships that were in orientated, in other words, with his disciples, with those who were part of his faith community. And then the relationships which were outward looking, relationships to the wider world, out into the world, making a difference, bringing hope, bringing peace, making a difference in people's lives day by day by day. And it has to be said that this didn't happen by accident. It was intentional. Jesus planned for his life to be very much like this. And I think the same is true for us. If we don't intentionally seek to live in a certain way, then life will run away with us. We'll get out of sync. We'll get out of tune with who we are truly meant to be. And that just passes us by quite often. And we don't think about these things. We think things are okay, but actually, deep down, is there not a dis-ease within so many people? Jesus too spoke about the importance of closeness to God throughout our lives, about our connection with him being crucial. "I am the vine," he says in John 15, "you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. But apart from me, you can do nothing." God is our strength. Some of us as Christians can become so much activists that we lose touch with what is actually the heart of it all, which is our relationship with God. So we ask ourselves, I think, in line with Jesus' teaching and Jesus' example, are we really in tune with God? Or are we just charging ahead, even doing things in God's name, but having lost touch with him and with who he is? Because that's fundamentally our identity. We are children of God. We are human beings before we are human doings. So how have people approached living in this way in the past? How have people tried to live the way of Jesus, a life with a rhythm which is close to God? Well, let's think about the monastic movement. So let's think about monasticism, a very, very brief overview. There's lots that could be said, but here is just perhaps some key ideas about monasticism. It began with a group of people that are known as the Desert Fathers and Mothers. They found it hard to live a Christian life in the noise and busyness of the Roman Empire. They knew and found through experience that God was most easily found where there were fewer distractions. So they went off into the desert, many of them into the Egyptian desert, and they lived there. They found that the desert was a marvellous laboratory for dealing with the self. When all was stripped away, when all those voices and noises that can take us away from ourselves were taken out of the equation, then that's when people most often found themselves and were able to deal with themselves and who they are, and perhaps with their inner demons, with those inner issues and problems that they just couldn't deal with if they didn't have that time and that space set apart. They found a balance and rhythm of life there, and many went back into cities to serve the poor and the sick. So it wasn't just about escaping, it was coming away so that they could then go back and be a blessing to the world. Now, some of them lived as hermits, but many lived in communities, but each with a cell, with a place where they could go and find solitude and silence, where they could find strength. In time, monastic orders grew up. They developed a rule or a way or rhythm of life which helped them live in a balanced and healthy way. A life which was devoted to God and serving Him and the world in a whole number of ways. Below this video is a link to a YouTube video of The Monastery. The Monastery was a TV program recorded back in 2005, where 5 men left their daily lives and went to live for 6 weeks in a Benedictine monastery. Watch the clip below, if you like, and then come back to this. Because what we see in that video are examples of people finding a very different way of life. And if you look on YouTube and various places on the internet, you can see that actually those people's lives through those 6 weeks were changed. Each of them was changed in one way or another. A couple came to a faith in Christ through living in that community, through living a rhythm of life and of prayer, getting away from the hustle and bustle. And it was only when they did that that they could really see what was important in life. And I wonder sometimes whether in the church in general we go about our evangelism trying to get people to sign up to certain propositional truths as a starting point. I wonder whether in the future we need to be encouraging people to live out the way of life of Jesus, trying to get people to live a way of life which is so much healthier, which is so much deeper than the way most of us do in the Western world. Could that be a way of them finding God? Those who engaged with that monastery certainly found that. So, the monastery in question in the TV programme was a Benedictine monastery, and the Benedictine rule or the Benedictine way of life has certainly been one of the most influential for many, many centuries. People would join a religious order, not all of them Benedictine, but they would join a religious order as a novice to start with. They would explore the way of life, the rhythm of life, before making vows to join the monastery. The Benedictine way of life had 3 vows: obedience, to God and to the abbot of the monastery. Conversion of life, a realization that they were on a journey to become more Christ-like, and that the way they were today would not be the way they would be in the future. And the idea too, the third vow of stability, this was all about perseverance over the long term, sticking with things even when they were hard, sticking with living in a community that could be difficult at times, but actually finding that in that perseverance they found life. So the goal of the Benedictine way of life was to become more Christ-like. They believed it was important, and do believe in Benedictine monasteries today, to develop virtue by obeying Christ's commands in the workshop of that stable community. Obedience was important. Life in Christ begins with humility, and humility begins with obedience. And humility, a teachability, a willingness to learn new things, a willingness to admit that perhaps in the past you've been wrong, was so important for them. And also, the restraint of speech was important. Work was important as part of the rhythm of life. So depending on where the monastery was, things like farming, brewing, care of the sick, cooking, cleaning, and so on were all things which were an important part of the rhythm of life. Hospitality to travellers and visitors was central for them, as was simplicity in terms of food, wine and possessions. In fact, Rule 55 of Benedict's rule says if your wardrobe won't shut, then you've got too many clothes. All monastic traditions see that solitude and silence are crucial. Coming away from busyness, finding places of solitude and silence are crucial if we're to become more Christ-like, if we're to become the people we were meant to be. The Benedictine way of life includes a rhythm of prayer, which includes praying at 6 different times for a period of 10 minutes to up to 35 minutes. Those times last. But they get into this rhythm of praying together and praying alone. But these rhythms of prayer together happening 6 times within each 24-hour period. So what can we learn from all that? What can we learn from the history of monasticism for life today? Well, of course, most of us don't live in cloistered communities. We live in the world of work and bills and children and stress and pressure. 82 years ago, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian and pastor who opposed Hitler and who ultimately gave his life for that opposition, wrote this. He wrote, "The restoration of the Church will surely come only from a new type of monasticism, which has nothing in common with the old but a complete lack of compromise in a life lived in accordance with the Sermon on the Mount, in the discipleship of Christ. I think it's time to gather people together to do this." And over the last decade or two, this has started to happen more and more and more. And this movement across the world is known as New Monasticism. These are new communities which are growing up, influenced by old monasticism, if you like. The common marks include a stronger focus on intentional community, patterns of prayer, contemplation, hospitality and practical engagement in mission beyond itself, often to the poor, than is normal in your average church setting. Unlike old monasticism, new monastic groups tend to have a dispersed life, a scattered life, where they might come together to meet together every now and again, some more than others, but essentially they will live out that community in a different way to perhaps the way old monastic communities did do. It won't be as much of a physical gathering as a network type of gathering. And this is what we see in the world today, where fewer people connect with people on a geographical basis in terms of geographical communities. Younger people particularly connect more and more through networks, through interests, some of those online too. Each new monastic group will have its own particular calling and identity that reflect all those variables. These new monastic communities are incarnational or culturally specific. So it's not about importing necessarily a model from another place, from another culture. It's about working out in that culture, in that place, what a rhythm of life will look like. So the universal aim is to find a shared way of life which works in the real world that we live in, often with flexibility to adapt to individual circumstances. And the elements of a way of life, a rhythm of life, include things like the importance of community. It's not something you do alone, it's something you do as part of a community. Of course, the call to Christ in the New Testament is always the call to community, never to isolation. New monastic communities often, always in fact, have a shared rhythm of prayer, and often that's a simple and flexible one. Silence and solitude is important too. And they would seek to have shared priorities and values, for example, simplicity, mission as a priority, and lifelong learning. There are four main themes running through all of these new monastic communities. The first is in terms of aspirations, where the question is asked, how should we live? How can we live healthfully and justly in the context in which we find ourselves? What are our aspirations? The Northumbria community, for example, have two key aspirations. The first is availability to God and to others, and this will be worked out through solitude, silence, hospitality, through mission, and through intercession, through praying for others. Their second aspiration is vulnerability, which is all about being open to be taught new things, not thinking that we know it all, always being ready for God to teach us new things and not getting stuck in a rut. And I think many people in traditional churches do get stuck in a rut. Another example is the Moot community in London, a community which works amongst those and lives amongst the city in London, particularly young professionals there. And they ask the question, a key to their aspiration is this: how can we live in but not of contemporary culture? How can we be part of the way the world really is, but without going along perhaps with everything that contemporary culture would tell us are the values we should have? For them, their community is a community of creativity in worship, in prayer, and in their lives in general. And it's important too that they have a balance of work and rest and play. The second theme running through these communities are virtues, or morality, if you like, a disciplined approach to the thoughts which give us life. So they would ask, what is important in terms of who we are, and how can these things be nurtured? Well, the Beatitudes, Jesus' teaching there, are often a focus as these virtues are being worked out. And they would be things like generosity, simplicity and moderation, patience, humility and honesty. The third theme running through these communities would be one of spiritual practices which express the vocation these groups have to worship, to mission and to community too. Incidentally, those three things, worship, community and mission, are the three things which, working together, form all disciples, all followers of Jesus. If we've got one of those three things missing, then there's something missing in our formation as followers of Jesus. These spiritual practices for these communities need to be flexible enough to fit in with the diverse lives within a dispersed community. Example of moot again. The practice of prayer and meditation is central, as is the practice of mercy and justice, and the practice of learning, discussion, reading, going on retreats, and so on, and the practice of mission, the practice of actually being out there in the world, bringing the love of God in a whole number of ways. The 24/7 boiler room movement is one which began its life in the United States. For them, the practices which are central are prayer, mission, mercy and justice, hospitality and pilgrimage, creativity and learning and discipleship. So there are many things in common there with the Benedictine way of life, the way of life of Moot and of other communities such as the Northumbria community too. The final theme running through these new monastic communities is one of postures, and this is all to do with an attitude towards God and an openness to Him in all of life. This is usually the last to be developed, if it's developed at all in these communities. Some don't get that far, but in terms of postures we're talking about things like an awareness of God's presence in all things, an openness to Him, mindfulness, living in the present moment, an sense of expectancy and of wonder too. One example is the community of Aidan and Hilda, which has its base on the island of Lindisfarne, Holy Island, off the Northumbrian coast. This is an internationally dispersed community of Christians following a way of life, a rhythm of life together, and a rule or rhythm of prayer. And like many of these new communities, it has the Celtic tradition at its heart. It currently has about 100 members, which are described as voyagers, and over 200 explorers, people who are testing out their membership. They also have friends, people who are not fully yet committed to the community, but people who will keep in touch with and support the work of the community. The community of Aidan and Hilda has 3 vows at its heart: simplicity, purity, and obedience. And everyone in the community is encouraged to have a soul friend or an anam cara. This is someone to support and journey with them. If we think of the way that Jesus made disciples, it was very relational. It wasn't a classroom type of model. It wasn't taking people through a course. It was about the relationship that He enjoyed with a small number of people, modelling a way of life, supporting that way of life as others seek to live it. And so this community encourages people to have people who walk alongside each other to help them live this rhythm of life. The way of life of the community has 10 key elements which are applied to individuals' lives. So members of the community are encouraged to work out a rhythm of life, a way of life that includes aspects of all of the following. And they are lifelong learning, a recognition that we are on a spiritual journey and that we've not arrived yet. Important is a rhythm of work, prayer and recreation in life through the year, month, week, through each day. The importance of intercession, praying for others. A simplicity of life, so that we're not burdened by things. A care for creation, the healing of fragmented people and communities, an openness to God's Spirit and to listening to what He might be saying. Unity, Christian unity, is crucial for them, as is mission, reaching out into the world with the love of God in a whole number of ways. At the festival we heard a couple of stories of people who had lived in community or who are currently living in community, be they communities that live in the same geographical space, such as those training for ordained ministry in the community of the Resurrection at Murfield, and those who are training for ministry in a more dispersed way as well, and finding how to be community when they spend far less time together physically than students who live at Murfield do. Those kinds of stories are well worth hearing, and if you Google living in Christian community, you'll find many examples on the internet of people who have lived and are living in community with other Christians in a whole number of different ways. But with new monasticism, the key here is finding a way of living together when there is little time or little possibility of being physically in the same place, at least on a very regular basis. So having heard all this, we asked the people at the sessions we ran in the Festival 2017, what do you think communities like these can offer Christians and the wider world in the 21st century? Could they be a way of supporting people as they follow Jesus? Could it be a way that people could explore following Jesus, explore what living life in all its fullness is actually about? Our belief is that God does want us to dream big dreams for Him, that often we settle for so much less in life than God has in mind for us. Somebody at one of the sessions told me a story that years ago they were challenged by someone in their church who said to them that God had a whole wedding cake for them to eat, but they seemed to be satisfied just with crumbs. How many of us live our Christian lives in that way, really not connecting with God in ways that could really open up a whole new way of living and a whole new life to us? So we asked, and we continue to ask, what about a dispersed community across the valley that may meet together a few times each year? What about a community that has locally developed aspirations and principles? A community that knows what it's about? A community with a locally developed and flexible way of life that can help one another to grow closer to God, to be followers of Jesus who make a real difference in the world? What about a community with a locally developed and flexible rhythm of prayer that we could go about in our daily lives? Just the knowledge of knowing that other people will be praying the same prayer as us sometime early morning, perhaps sometimes in the evening, maybe even sometime around lunchtime too, can be a tremendous encouragement, because it helps us to join in with others as we stop and as we turn towards God, even in the midst of busy days which so many people live. What about a community that has different levels of belonging? For example, opportunities to explore being part of that community before committing fully to be part of it. What about a community across the valley with a support network of soul friends who walk alongside other people? That relational aspect of following Jesus. We asked people to leave details if they were interested in finding out more, and by the end of the second session we had 16 people wanting to explore this, and this is what we will be doing in the future. If you're listening to this and watching this YouTube video, just look at the This is Discipleship website that this is on, and just acknowledge your interest on there. Get in touch with the churches across the valley, the Anglican churches across the valley, and someone will be able to help you to explore what being part of a community could be like. Finally, this has the potential, this idea of a new monastic community in this place does have the potential to make a huge difference to people's lives, and has the potential to make a huge difference to the mission of God's church in this place too. So in the midst of our Western world, which has many good things, but also which in many ways dehumanises us and doesn't enable us perhaps to really and truly be in contact with God and with ourselves and with one another, could it be that this new type of community that can help us develop a rhythm of life can help us to know what Jesus meant when he said, "I have come that you may have life, and life to the full"?